This video was produced for Newcastle Disability Forum's No Steps History Walks project, funded by the People's Health Trust using money raised by the Health Lottery, North East and Cumbria. In my first talk I mentioned the origins of the Tyne Bridges, starting with the Romans, then the medieval bridge, which lasted until the 18th century. After the Georgian bridge was found to be an obstacle to shipping, it was, eventually, replaced by the famous swing bridge. And of course the great engineer Robert Stephenson designed the high-level bridge, which allowed steam trains to cross the river, taking railway passengers right into the heart of the city. But of course, it wasn't all a story of relentless progress. The Victorian era was also a time of hideous disasters. One of the worst happened not long after the high-level bridge was built, and this terrible catastrophe was intimately linked with the bridges, for one simple reason. The old Georgian bridge, with its low arches, made it impossible for cargo ships to go very far upriver. This naturally led to the concentration of warehouses downstream of the bridge on the quaysides of Newcastle and Gateshead. In those days, health and safety matters were largely down to a property's owner, and that meant most businesses were just one small spark away from a major fire. About midnight on Friday, October the 6th, 1854, someone raised the alarm. The Gateshead worsted factory belonging to J. Wilson & Sons was on fire. This was not entirely surprising, as Wilson's factory had in fact been built on the site of a previous one that had burned down. It was, like most buildings at the time, lit by gas. The making of worsted cloth involved treating wool with oil. The phrase "accident waiting to happen" does spring to mind. At first the fire was confined to the upper story of the building, and people raced to retrieve stock from the ground floor. Fire engines from both sides of the river turned up promptly, and it seemed at first as if the blaze would be brought under control. Large numbers of people turned out from nearby tenements to watch the free show. Sadly, within an hour, the factory was a smoking wreck, despite the heroic efforts of the firemen, and it seemed the show was over. But in fact, things had only just begun. Nearby was a bonded warehouse, a 7-story building used to store ships' cargoes. Among the materials in it that night was sulphur and nitrate of soda, among other dangerous chemicals. The warehouse had been built with safety in mind, complete with massive metal pillars and the best fire precautions available at the time. But they all proved inadequate. The heat from the factory fire caused the sulphur to ignite and melt, flooding out of the windows like a stream of lava. A military fire engine had arrived by this time, and again the firefighters battled heroically against the flames, but soon the entire bonded warehouse was ablaze, with one witness describing it as like a cataract on fire. People crowded onto the bridges to watch the spectacle. Thousands of onlookers, including lots of children, seemed to have no thought of any potential danger. Then there was a small explosion. This should have alerted everyone, but it seems to have been ignored, and so was a second, and a third. The fourth explosion, however, was heard 40 miles away. The parish church on the hill above the quayside was almost destroyed, the hands of its clock frozen at 10 to 3. Ships on the river were lifted almost clear of the water. The old bridge shook, houses were wrecked, and debris flew through the air for miles. A stone block weighing 18 pounds fell through the roof of an optician on Grey Street. A 6-foot beam was found on the roof of All Saints' Church. Miners at Monk Wearmouth Colliery rushed to the surface, naturally assuming it was an underground explosion nearby. The bang was heard in Hartlepool, Hexham and Alnwick, and by ships 20 miles out at sea. The crater was later measured at 40 feet in depth and 50 feet across. And that was not the end of it. Burning debris fell across Newcastle and Gateshead. Much of Butcher Bank and Pilgrim Street caught fire, and all the fire engines had of course been buried in the rubble of the blast. Unchecked, the Newcastle fires burned into the next day. Fresh fires were also started in Gateshead. The mayors of both towns used the newly developed telegraph to call for help after the wires had been repaired, and in Gateshead gunpowder was used to blow up buildings to create a firebreak. Eventually the fires were brought under control and people started to assess the scale of the damage. Newcastle looked as if it had been subject to an artillery bombardment, with 9 out of 10 properties destroyed on Sand Hill alone. And yet, only 53 people were found to have been killed, though hundreds more suffered serious injuries. Among the dead was Alexander Dobson, the 26-year-old son of the famous architect John Dobson. He was only identified thanks to a bunch of keys and some of his coat. His body was described as a charred and crumbling mass. A disaster relief fund raised thousands of pounds. 2 inquests, one on each side of the river, reached no firm conclusions about the origins of the Worsted factory fire. Around 800 homes and businesses were affected. Total damage was put at £500,000. John Dobson's famous redevelopment of Newcastle was, in part, a memorial to his lost son. Let's move on to a happier topic. The high-level bridge had demonstrated that new technology could carry rail passengers safely over the river. Road traffic also expanded hugely, later on thanks to the internal combustion engine. A new road bridge to augment Stevenson's Crossing had been discussed as far back as 1860. Finally, after the Great War, the corporations of Newcastle and Gateshead decided to act. They accepted a proposal by a civil engineer, Mr. T.M. Webster. A large government subsidy was on offer as a way of alleviating unemployment, which was biting very hard at the time. An Act of Parliament is required for all new bridges, so one was passed, receiving the royal assent on the 7th of August 1924. The Tyne Improvement Commissioners set very high standards for the bridge, specifying it could not impede river traffic in any way, even during construction. This meant that a single-span bridge would have to be built in a radical and daring fashion. The design was produced by a London firm of consulting engineers, Mott, Hay and Anderson. 5 firms competed for the contract. Winner was Dorman, Long and Company of Middlesbrough. The plan involved putting up 2 huge bridge pylons on either riverbank and then building outward to meet in the middle. The pylons, designed by Robert Burns Dick, were originally intended to be much taller. It so happened that a similar project, conceived by the same team, was already underway at Sydney Harbour in Australia. This later gave rise to claims that the Sydney Harbour Bridge was based on the new Tyne Bridge, but this is not so. In any case, the design concept was not original. It was derived from Hell Gate Bridge in New York. However, that bridge had been built by lifting material from barges, which wasn't allowed on the Tyne or in Sydney Harbour. Dorman Long's chief engineer, Ralph Freeman, had devised a novel method to get round this problem. The new Tyne Bridge was to have a span of 531 feet and a road deck 85 feet above high water mark. Work began in August 1925. Freeman's method was to use cranes, cables and cantilevers to build out across the river rather than raising girders up. It was like building a ship, in fact, using shipyard techniques to rivet and weld panels together. The Tyne Bridge provided Dorman Long with a test bed for new methods that they used on the far bigger bridge in Sydney. But it was the working men of Tyneside who were the key to the whole project, working far above the river without any modern safety equipment. Only one life was lost. Nathaniel Collins, a scaffolder from South Shields and a veteran of the Great War, sadly fell to his death not long before the bridge was completed. The new Tyne Bridge, as it was officially known, was finished on the 5th of February 1928, over 3 years before its big brother in Australia. It was the largest single-span bridge in Britain and cost £1.2 million. It was opened on the 10th of October by King George V and Queen Mary. The royal couple made the first journey over the bridge, riding in an Ascot landau. 2,000 schoolchildren were given the day off and received a commemorative brochure. And if you're wondering what King George V said on that great day, well, here he is, courtesy of a crackly old movie-tone news recording.
The Queen and I thank you for your loyal and dutiful address and its words of cordial welcome. It is a great pleasure to us to visit Gateshead on the occasion of opening the new bridge, which so nobly spans the River Tyne and forms another great highway between the two countries. I am happy to recall the visit paid to the ancient town of Gateshead by my dear father when he opened the King Edward VII Bridge. The similar ceremony which we are today performing forges a fresh link in the chain associating my family with the Tyneside towns. I warmly congratulate you on joining with your neighbours to erect the new bridge. It is a worthy testimony to the energy and foresight which enabled the Tyneside towns to take their full and honourable share in the industrial development of Great Britain. I have noted with deep solicitude how many formerly prosperous industries have been and are still passing through times of depression. It is therefore all the more gratifying to know that much as your town has suffered, you have shown your enlightened public spirit in proceeding with this great civic enterprise. Those who have planned, designed and executed this work may justly be proud of their labours. I pray that with God's blessing, more prosperous times may soon return, that your trade may reap the benefit of these improved communications.
Thank you, Your Majesty, and I like the beard. Since 1925, the bridge has become an international symbol of Tyneside and remains much loved. And it's been joined in recent years by two newcomers, the Queen Elizabeth II Metro Bridge, opened in 1981 by the Queen, and the famous Millennium or Blinking Eye Bridge, opened in 2002, again by the Queen. It seems every time she comes up, she opens a bridge. The Metro Bridge doesn't get much attention, perhaps because it's quite functional and unspectacular, but it should be noted that since 2007, a huge artwork has been installed on it. Called Nocturne and designed by Navan Kulkarni, this is a display of 140 LED lights creating patterns of colour based on photos submitted by the general public. The Millennium Bridge, of course, has its own lighting scheme, but it's the unique blinking eye design that tends to attract the most attention. The opening and closing process is so energy efficient that in 2017 it was calculated it costs less than £4 a time. Designed by the architects Wilkinson Eyre and engineering firm Gifford, it's unique and has won many awards. There are of course many other bridges over the Tyne, too numerous to mention really. Then there's the Tyne Tunnel and the Tyne Ferry. It's fair to say that, if you want to cross the Tyne, you've got a decent range of options. It will be interesting to see the reaction to all those spectacular structures from the Emperor Hadrian, who started it all in 120 AD by deciding to put a nice new bridge at one end of his wall.